So there's an interesting debate that's starting to rage, and especially from the standpoint of the left. Did Bernie Sanders sell out America in supporting that bill? 96 senators put their gold stamp of approval on that bill when that bill went through the House. That bill is a corporate giveaway. Yes, it may be $2 trillion, but ultimately up to $4.5 trillion is going to be able to be used for the corporate class with very few strings attached. Whereas the American population that is literally in the middle of a pandemic where millions of people are going to potentially die as a result of the policies that Trump are taking, can't get the ventilators, can't get the equipment that they need, the safety equipment. They're out there begging other countries in order to help us out. I mean, this is utterly shameful. You want to know if you are ever curious about who your country cares about? I would say look at who needs gets attended to, especially in moments of crisis. Meaning the government has limited resources, and in the context of those limited resources, they have to go somewhere. It chooses. Somebody chooses. And what did they choose? We're going to give gobs and gobs and gobs of money to the corporate class. We're going to throw these pennies at everybody else. And you end up with a situation that Sanders is in Congress fighting in a box. Basically, the Republican Party put out this weak bit of legislation that didn't deal with the material needs of Americans in any real terms, just a pittance. You look at other countries around the world and the actions they took, and then you look back here at the United States from the standpoint of preparedness and from the standpoint of what you're doing for the population itself to ensure that they stay at home, ensure their healthcare needs are taken care of, ensure that the healthcare workers are whole, ensure that the outbreak doesn't necessarily explode based on some kind of capitalistic concern of getting the economy up and running prematurely. This country is fundamentally broken. I don't know how you come to a different conclusion. In this midst of this crisis, your government, in the midst of income inequality that is wildly out of proportion, in the shadow of a 2008 bailout that the public widely rejects, and you're doing it again. And you're giving a pittance to one side of the political spectrum and to the other side that much more. Meaning the income inequality that already exists, that is beyond anything else that we've ever seen in the history of this country, will now further explode. And as that further explodes, those companies are going to get that much more power and that much more influence in our system. The question at hand, did Bernie Sanders sell us out? That's the question. Jimmy Dore raised this when he was having a conversation with Matt Stoller, and I thought it was a fascinating conversation. And I'm going to let them make their case, and then I'm going to make my case. But just so we're clear, I just want to read one part of this. This is HuffPost. The final text of the bill has not yet been released, but according to the legislative draft, the new law would establish $4.5 trillion corporate bailout fund overseen by Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, with few substantial constraints. Some outlets are reporting this as $500 billion fund, but $425 billion of that can be leveraged 10 times by the Federal Reserve, resulting in multi-trillion-dollar program. The best that they can do for American workers is $1,200. Nothing going forward, something that may persist itself for several months on end. But immediately, the needs that get attended to is this oligarchical class. What I'm asking you is, why is that okay? Whatever your political distribution is, left, right, whatever, why is that okay? Why are you okay with your government attending to the needs this almost fascistically? Like it's almost like a type of sycophant in the way that they throw themselves at this moneyed class. I understand why they'll do it. I get their political incentives. But why should the American public be okay with it? Where is the righteous indignation and rage over this stuff? I mean, this is a giveaway, but not to the middle class, not to the poor. I would be perfectly okay if they ran with a particular policy to ensure not just that the people keep their jobs, but also to ensure that people are made whole in the sense that they're not going to materially lose, be it their house, be it their car, be it their whatever. just because of an economic downturn that had nothing to do with them. And instead, our objective, our goal, our main focus is to give money to the other class. It's utterly astonishing. And just so we're very clear, in exchange for the takeover, the Democratic Party gets 4 months of more generous unemployment benefits for the millions who are laid off and a one-time check of $1,200 per adult, eliminating the Republican restriction that would have limited the poor to just $600. Now, understand what that means. The Republican Party, with this measly bill, adds in a provision. That provision saying, all right, we're going to fuck the poor, and we're going to fuck them that much more. Which means that the fight that you end up having is not over the onerousness or the inadequacies of the bill per se. You end up fighting on this measly front of that fucking provision. And maybe other provisions that was either less oversight or anything else. They put in some token restraints that don't necessarily get to the heart of protecting the money and where that money is going to go. And yeah, again, the bulk of this is going to go to a particular class without few restraints. You didn't get any equity in the companies. You didn't get a situation where we could restructure our capitalistic system in a way of putting workers on the boards of some of these companies, maybe making some of these companies worker co-ops. I mean, your corporations and plutocrats often like to make this argument that I did this on my own. I did it all by myself. I was the rugged individualist. There was nobody that helped me, etc. Missing the point of the roads, the air, the cops, the fire department, the military, in order to keep them and their business safe, or for that matter, open up lanes in other countries. They ignore all of that. They ignore the fact that in order for them to have a company, somebody has to buy their product, or for that matter, somebody has to work at their stores. All that gets ignored and boiled down to, I did this. You are now having all of these industries with their hat in their hand begging for a handout. Fine. The public should get something for that handout. And if that means a restructure of our system, then that should be the penalty for their insolvency. Many of these guys started buying back their stock as opposed to investing in the company itself. I mean, we basically rewarding bad behavior. And every time there's a crisis, inevitably, somebody comes up with an indubitably horrible idea that we got to give one particular class that much more cash. This is no different. Let's listen to Dylan Ratigan. Ratigan is going to explain his point of view in regards to what has taken place.
Yesterday, there was a double count. So the Fed's $4 trillion, the insurance is $4 trillion, and the stimulus is $2 trillion. There was a double counting of the Fed's $4 trillion with the stimulus.
Okay.
So it was, which is how it ended up at 14 yesterday. And so I appreciate your faith in my reporting with you, and so I think it's important that I clarify when these things become finalized.
So what they're really pumping in. So I don't understand those numbers, but what I know is that they're going to give $425 million to the Fed, and then the Fed is going to give out that money to corporations at the Treasury Department and the Fed's behest. And there's no accounting for where they're going to spend that money before they spend it. There's only going to be a perfunctory, oversight board of 5 people who are going to look into $4.2 trillion worth of money given out.
Well, again, there's a $4 trillion at the Fed, then there's a $2 trillion with the government. It doesn't really matter. The point is, because your point remains the same regardless of the dollar amounts or where the allocations are. It's an abomination beyond all comprehension, James.
So this isn't about. So this is exactly. So this is not. So the reason why they have.
Well, this is what this is. This is a further consolidation of wealth among the super rich by giving only the super rich money at a time when asset prices are down and everything is depressed, so that the super rich can take the taxpayers' money and buy more of all the assets to increase their stranglehold and hammerlock on America.
And so why isn't anybody screaming about this, Dylan? Why is everyone acting like this is a good bill?
Because people on both the left and the right, although more on the left, I would think the most obvious people that should be most ashamed of themselves in this situation would be Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren for obvious reasons. but that's just the beginning of the list. The fear of appearing to try to do something that is outside the scope of the historical corruption of this country at a time when the government is trying to appear to be active in the face of the crisis. The desire or willingness to do something outside the scope of that corruption, it is proven that not a single politician in America has the teeth or the stomach to do that.
So Dylan Ratigan is very clear in making the point that this is an abomination beyond all comprehension. Basically, this is a ripoff. This bill, this massive, massive bill, they made the argument of 6.5 trillion, I believe, public coffers. I don't care if the public or if the government, the people of our particular society come together and make an argument of saying, look, we need to ensure that each and every person gets a basic income. That's what we're going to do. We're going to have a reverse income tax or a universal basic income. Why? Because we believe that people are important. We want to make sure that people have the very basics of what they need as they go through the world. This is not going to affect anything else, meaning services or whatever else. This is money from the government to you. Meaning whether or not we're in the middle of an epidemic or not, I am perfectly okay with this notion of a UBI, especially so in the case of a crisis. And in the context of that crisis, I don't care if we give money to the American public. I don't care if that needs to go for 2 months. Ultimately, the whole point is to flatten the curve and the infection rate so you don't necessarily overwhelm your various hospitals and everything else. If we get overwhelmed, it is going to come to a halt regardless. It is far better to effectively take the China method and social distance and force the numbers down. China at this point has 1.3 billion people and are less cases than us. And we're just on the uptick. We've just begun. And China, for the most part, has brought their cases down. His argument is this is a betrayal. Yes, you're throwing crumbs to the workers, but basically you're putting a massive transfer of wealth into the hands of a class that doesn't need that massive transfer of wealth. There were better ways where you could do this bill. You could have focused on the workers, the public, and everything else in order to keep the economy afloat to some degree, to make sure that those people had the things that they need, that they weren't going to get evicted from their homes, that they weren't going to lose their cars. You could have did all that. But that's not what they did. That's not what they did. They put a ton of pressure on the various Congress members, especially in the context of the Senate when the Republican Party ran with it. And yet, you have a Democratic Party that didn't fight all that hard. And you have to question, their donors are effectively the same people. Every time a tax cut comes up, the Democratic Party falls in line with the Republican Party and passes it. This was no different. Yes, you were using the club of the weakness of the American population over the course of these years, as you've been effectively browbeat these people down, using their weakness and vulnerability as a way to kind of compel action. And that's so fucking disgusting, but that's basically what's taken place. If the American public was sturdy, if you had a situation where people had resources, had money in the bank, and you have a crisis, you're not compelled to immediately act almost overnight in order to deal with the crisis. People would have the things that they needed to get from point A to point B at the little bit for some level of reflection, as opposed to the knee-jerk reaction where they can effectively have a cash smash and grab. Dylan Ratigan makes the point that these people should be ashamed of themselves. They sold us out. Matt Stoller is having a back and forth with Jordan Chariton. And I really thought this one was really, really interesting. And it gets to the whole thing again. Did Bernie Sanders sell us out? Did Bernie Sanders sell America out? And by the way, just so we're clear, Sanders got into an argument on the floor of the Senate. Now, listen to the argument. Because my argument is that the Republican Party was hitting on so many fronts that they took a maximalist position on everything. Meaning, we're going to put through policy to fuck the poor. Now, how do you contest some of the other bigger items in the bill without dealing with that particular part? Meaning, if the Republican Party say, yeah, we don't want to budge on that front, and you end up expending energy fighting on that small part, and you got to fight on that small part, right? Because that bill, and that is pretty much onerous. But that's there to be onerous and to be somewhat of a deflection from the larger point that the bill is massively, grossly inadequate and is basically a corporate giveaway. Sanders is on the floor fighting hard for the smallest of things.
And now I find that some of my Republican colleagues are very distressed. They're very upset that somebody who's making 10, 12 bucks an hour might end up with a paycheck for 4 months more than they received last week. Oh my God, the universe is collapsing. Imagine that. Somebody who's making 12 bucks an hour, now like the rest of us, faces an unprecedented economic crisis with the 600 bucks on top of their regular unemployment check, might be making a few bucks more for 4 months. Oh my word! Will the universe survive? How absurd and wrong is that? What kind of value system is that? Meanwhile, these very same folks had no problem a couple of years ago voting for $1 trillion in tax breaks for billionaires and large profitable corporations.
Right there. Right there. Think of all the propaganda you get from the time that you're a child up until the time you become an adult. They tell you that you're a government for and by the people, that basically you're representative government. The government supposedly represents the interests of the public. It's the democracy because you have, two parties, whereas one party is something else. I would make an argument that this is not a two-party state. You have these two parties that fundamentally agree that the world is exactly the way it is, with modest changes around the edges. Those aren't two parties. Those are effectively the exact same party with just two different wings of the party. But in this very specific instance, he's fighting for the smallest of things in order to just get that very basic point of, you guys were perfectly willing to give these tax cuts on a whim. Nobody thought twice about it. And then you have the situation where there is a literal crisis within the context of the public, and your response to this is, we need to cater to the interests of big business and the wealthy. And that's utterly astonishing. But my point is, from the standpoint of the American public, how do they look at that? How do you, as an American citizen, again, I don't give a shit about your political disposition. How do you, as an American citizen, read that? Look at that. Look at what they were doing in the way that they were passing those onerous tax cuts. Look at the income inequality level that was already there. Obama gave 95% of the income gains to the top 1%. Think of all the fucking labor that goes on in the context of our system and our society. Think of all the things that it takes to make this society go. You want to know the important aspect of our society between labor and capital? It's labor. The moment that labor got sick, the economy hit the skids. Yes. All of them require you to either work at their stores or buy their products. You are instrumental to their success. You're instrumental to allowing them to be billionaires. And in this context, in this situation, in the middle of a national crisis, Congress jumps to account to ensure that their oligarchs are okay. How does an American look at that and reconcile that with the propaganda that they've had of a government by and for the people? Why would a government that is by and for the people, let's say the majority of the people, turn around and give the corporate class that much cash? They wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. I don't know how people reconcile that. How do you reconcile this myth of democracy, this myth that this country is this representative government, and you have shit like this, where on a whim, they would give all of that money. You look around at the other countries like Canada, even the UK, in regards to what they were doing to ensure that their civilizations and their populations was okay. And you look at what they're doing here. It is modest and massively insufficient. And yet, here we are. Will the American public get pissed off? That's my question.
Schumer and Michael Bennet. And finally, you say, the situation was obvious on Saturday. They had time to organize. They knew what was happening. Bernie and Warren sold you out because they are cowards. Same with Josh Hawley on the right. Wow, that's strong language, Matthew. So tell me, how did Bernie Sanders sell us out? Didn't he do the right thing? As Jordan said, that if he didn't do this, then people wouldn't get the unemployment. What do you say to that?
Well, the whole thing is just annoying and stupid. look, Dave Dayen and I and a bunch of others that saw this coming have either worked in the Senate. I worked in the Senate. Dave Dayen did reporting on the financial crisis. There's a whole bunch of others, Amanda Fisher and Graham Steele. These are people that know what they're doing. They understand banking law. They were there. All of the justifications that you see for why we had to pass this bill are exactly the justifications that they used to pass the bailout in 2008. It's total bullshit. But I'll start from the beginning, which was last week. Mitch McConnell cut out all of the Democrats and said, here, we need a big corporate bailout bill to address the pandemic. It was an obvious attempt to loot because the stock market was crashing. And at that moment, I wrote a piece on, I think it was on Saturday, saying this was a corporate coup because there's a whole bunch of dirty slush funds in there that we know about. The Fed is opening up its own slush funds. It's disgusting. But the point is we knew about it last week. And at that moment, if you want to do something about it, you organize. You get a few people together. You come out. You say, no, this is bad. Don't do this. And then you have a separate bargaining block. And you can threaten to take down a bill. And the debate becomes, should we bail out Wall Street in response to a pandemic, or should we rush immediate relief? And obviously what we need to do is rush immediate relief. But instead of doing that, Bernie Sanders...
Well, right there. I want to stop right there for the moment. Because this goes back to my point, this failure of imagination. The Democratic Party has the House. That's true. In the context of having the House, you have a situation where the economy hits the skids. Okay. You have a situation where the President of the United States is incompetent and he's going to get millions of people killed. Okay. The best policy is to ensure these people stay at home, meaning either they're going to lose their jobs, either they're going to have an incentive to still go into work despite being ill, or for that matter, not going to get health care while they're sick. Meaning we have all sorts of incentives in our society that has the worst case scenario that's just infinitely foreseeable to take place. I mean, we've been into this for maybe a month, and we've already surpassed every other state in regards to cases. So, you know, I guess the point I'm trying to make here is they rushed this bill through under the context of an emergency. And I understand the pressure that is put on the various Congress members and everything else. But the basic point becomes they are screwing over, they are looting the public purse. And should you capitulate to this, or should you have come up with your own plan? You own the House. Why not come up with just a clear, straight plan of, yes, we're going to get this money to the American public as soon as possible. Even if you didn't take every tenet that was in Sanders' plan, you should have came up with a straight bill that just said, this is what we're going to do, and pass that bill and force, at the very least, the Republican Party to say, no, we want to add tax cuts in for corporations, or we want to give more money to corporations. Make them make that argument. That's perfectly okay for them to make that argument. Why wouldn't you want to get into that particular fight? You're going to force them to argue something that is onerous from the standpoint of the way the public sees the stuff. But you don't do that. The Republican Party gets the lead in. Trump, even though he's horrific and is literally out there arguing that, hey, we don't need that many ventilators. People are talking about that many ventilators. We don't need that many ventilators. I mean, that number is overblown. While at the same token, 4.5 trillion or 6 trillion, how much ever that number was, in regards to corporate handouts. His point is that Sanders sold you out, that he had the capacity to try to hold this bill up for some level of moral courage to say, no, I'm not going to let them loot the Treasury in this way. Also, I kind of made this point once before. Many people are not going to get this money for months, meaning the complication of the bill itself to some degree slows down the rate at which this money can get out to the various public. The Democratic Party could have pushed for a straight bill. They could have pushed for all sorts of concessions. They didn't do it. They didn't have this idea of imagination or anything else. And to be fair, the Republicans do have the Senate. By the same token, they did go along with this bill 96-0. Everybody fell in line. And I would imagine there was a certain amount of pressure put on people, especially when they know how bad the virus is and how unprepared we were. The problem is this doesn't necessarily address some of the major concerns of the virus. Meaning how people are going to get their health care, how are you going to make sure you get the tests, do you have enough respirators and equipment for the various people in the various places around the country? All of these answers are no. Regardless of what Trump is lying about, all of these answers are no. And in the moment of crisis, our big idea is we need to give more money to corporations. They're right. It's outrageous. Let him make his argument. I want him to go further in the argument before I give my 2 cents.
And Elizabeth Warren and all the other progressives and all the other populists on the right stayed quiet. And that's because Warren is arrogant and foolish, and Bernie is a coward and a loser. And they won't talk to each other because they both have giant egos and they're not interested in actually wielding power. They also both want to be friends with Chuck Schumer. So they stayed quiet until, a couple of days ago, and let Schumer and Michael Bennet and a bunch of others negotiate the bill. Now, something people don't know about Bernie Sanders is that he's lazy and he doesn't actually deal with details. That's why when you actually push him on any details, he can't answer them. What he's really good at is talking to people about, why they don't have wages, and that's important. But honestly, if it wasn't a problem in 1985, he doesn't know how to handle it. Now, all the problems from 1985 are much worse today. So he sounds really good. But all the new things that come up, he can't actually talk about them. This was a new thing. This is a pandemic. He didn't organize. Warren didn't organize. The Progressive Caucus didn't organize. So they were presented with a fait accompli. All of the things in that bill were negotiated by Nancy Pelosi, her leaders, and Chuck Schumer. Bernie had nothing to do with it. He wasn't even in D.C. He never negotiates. It's just not the way that he works. Then at the very last moment, 3 Republicans come out and say, we think that there aren't enough mercenary-style hunting games of the poor in this bill. So we're going to put a hold on it. Even though for the last 5 days, Republicans have been saying that Democrats are not recognizing the urgency of situations, and Democrats were giving no speeches and making no arguments at all about this bill, including Warren, including Bernie. All right. So here you have Republicans saying this is urgent. We have to bail out Wall Street. Democrats saying nothing. Chuck Schumer and Pelosi negotiating with McConnell. At the very last moment, these 3 Republicans say we need to be meaner to the poor. At that point, a bunch of Democrats are trying to figure out, should we vote for this bill or should we not? And Bernie then says, we have to vote for this bill. And I'm paraphrasing, but if these guys are going to hold up the bill, these guys are going to object to the bill, which means it'll be delayed, then I'm going to object to the bill on different grounds until they drop their objection. And if they drop their objection, then I'm going to drop my objection and I'm going to vote for it. So their objection was based on the fact that you couldn't be mean enough to the poor. But the actual reason that you can't be mean enough to the poor is because the computer systems the government uses are so old and bad that it's actually hard to calculate, impossible to calculate on the time scale that you need how to send out the checks, except in very sort of, except you give everyone $600, but it's hard to make sure that people that don't deserve it don't get it. So before...
I want to point something else out also. When you have a society that caters to profit in the way that our society does, that worships the dollar in the way that our society does, the investment into things that you actually need fall by the wayside. Meaning, in a situation where you need a modernized system, you need the government to be lean, efficient, you need it to be capable in regards to what it can do and how it can distribute funds and get in contact with the various communities in our country that may actually need some level of assistance. But we don't invest in that. I mean, this is kind of like the power lines issue. We could invest in putting our power lines underground. We can get higher efficiency in regards to their on time and everything else. It would protect them from like storms and whatnot. It would be a better alternative for us in the way that we use and distribute power. I would even make the argument that we can put energy generators individually on each house to decentralize the power production. That way you're not necessarily stuck with the bill. But that's a separate point. Look, Stoller has a point. I guess I'm saying what we invest in, it should be guided by more than what's profitable for a particular class. And when we do that and we put all of these resources into this kind of top 1%, you end up with a situation that literally sucks that away from everybody else. Meaning, at a time where you need the government to be able to do a particular job, the government can't do the job well because the systems are so old, because they haven't necessarily put any investment in those systems. I find that aggravating. Like, this is something that all of us, for the most part, are supposed to be using for our best interests. The thing that holds back the night against the corporate class, our weapon of sorts. And that weapon has fundamentally been captured, both parties, by corporate oligarchical interests. And we are effectively locked out of the process. And I don't understand why people aren't angry at what they're seeing, meaning to look at the political space and you see the needs of one particular class being attended to magnificently, whereas all sorts of carnage has hit the economy and the president is downplaying the carnage, downplaying the need for the various supplies that we have, but at the same token, pulling out all the stops to give trillions of dollars to members of his class. How does that not, why is that not infuriating? Let's hear Stoller. Let's let him keep going. I want to let him make his full point before I say anything on it.
Before Bernie gives this speech on the Senate floor, somebody asked Trump and Mnuchin at a press conference, what about this objection from Lindsey Graham and Scott and I think a couple of others? And Mnuchin gets up and says, no, we don't agree with this. And Trump gets up and says, no, we don't agree with this. And then a few hours later, McConnell cuts a deal with these Republicans and says, you get to put an amendment up, which everybody knows is going to fail. And that's the deal. You get to get amendments and you get to vote symbolically against giving too much money to poor people. And then we're all going to vote for the bill. Now, in the debate, and I use sarcastic air quotes, Bernie gets up and says what these small group of Republicans want to do is bad. What we want to do is give money to people who are unemployed. And there's a lot of Democrats and Republicans who want to do this. And he says that. He's like, there's a lot of Republicans that want to do this too. And so this is outrageous. It's a complete grandstanding thing for a provision he didn't author. The amendment was a fake fight. It was annoying. The whole discussion was irritating. It was reckless because he didn't bother to organize last week. Neither did Warren, neither did any progressives. The bill is a disaster. It is worse than TARP. Bernie doesn't even understand what's in it. The whole thing is a mess, and I'm embarrassed about the entire progressive space. I think it's shameful. I think it's disgusting that they work for Wall Street and don't even know it. I mean, I'm angry, but you got to understand, I worked in the House and the Senate on the bailouts for 6 years. I have traced housing finance problems. I know a lot about the Federal Reserve. This is not a bunch of rubes coming in and saying that, just being angry about this. These are people who understand congressional process, who understand banking law, who understand bailouts, who understand the Federal Reserve. These are law professors. These are people who think about the operational details of getting money to people who need it. And we're the ones who are angry. And a bunch of dumb, cultist, cosplay leftists are the ones who are building a cult of personality around Bernie, a fundamentally lazy and stupid politician, so that they can protect their moral vanity. It's embarrassing. It's annoying. Shame on them. It's time to grow up, all right, and learn to govern instead of trying to, promote your moral vanity and liberal fantasies.
So you're saying that even Trump and Mnuchin were signaling that what Lindsey Graham was doing by holding up the unemployment, that was not going to stand?
Yes.
All right, so you get his point. This is a corporate cash grab. And in this, there was a bit of political theater where Sanders kind of held up and grandstanded over something that really wasn't necessarily a real thing. It was a bit of theater. Now, his point is, these were the fights that these guys were picking, and these weren't necessarily even real fights. Ultimately, they just passed the bill. Schumer, Pelosi, all of these guys got together, figured out what they wanted to do, and just passed an unimaginative bill that was basically a corporate giveaway. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party, there's this cynical belief that these guys don't necessarily get along or they can't necessarily get things done. I am more cynical because I think they can get things done, especially when it's things like this. We have something that we absolutely agree on, even though we might not necessarily say that overtly. We're just going to say we knuckled under, we're just weak, that's all. As opposed to we just fundamentally agree with this. Stoller, look, I think he has a point. Betray, it comes across as a bit strong to me. Now, the reason why betray comes across as a bit strong to me, I guess it depends on how you define that stuff. The definition of is. I would say there's probably all sorts of pressure being put on the various members of Congress to pass this bill. I would wager that everybody who's in that particular body wants to look like they're doing something. The Republican Party took the lead on it. The Republican Party was able to get the publicity for taking the lead on it. They get the bill in the Senate. They put in various provisions that, for the most part, said fuck the poor. And in putting in those provisions, you have fights over those minor provisions, while the entirety of the bill that is just massively inadequate still stands there as a corporate giveaway, whereas the public gets a measly $1,200. It is massively unequal. His point is, you shouldn't have passed this bill. I understand the pressure, I understand everything else, but there should be a moral principle at play that you shouldn't have to give this much money away to a corporate class that doesn't necessarily need it in the way that you're giving it to them, while simultaneously not getting anything for it, and at the expense of your population. And Sanders had to know this, still signed on to this anyway. And he's making the point, they basically sold us out. Sellout is too strong to me on this. Like, I can agree with the idea that he shouldn't have supported this bill. I understand it looks like you're grandstanding and everything else. Let's say just from a pure moral perspective, let's take out the politics. Let's say you just want to make a honest ideological position in the way of dealing with this particular bill. You could honestly stand up and say, yes, I'm not going to support this bill because ultimately this is a corporate giveaway and I want a bill that just goes directly to the American public in regards to their funding. That's what I want. Now, you could say that, you could do that. The catch becomes, how long can you pull that off? How long will that last? Meaning, how long can you hold up the entirety of this process, especially with everybody who's on board for it? I guess the point, though, is that it will take weeks for that check to get out anyway. So if it takes a little bit of time to have some level of scrutiny to this particular bill to see what's in this bill, then there is no harm in a few extra days or a few extra weeks. I guess that's my point. Anytime you have this thing where it has to be done right now, and you're saying it using the language, it's kind of like in Europe, where they were in the UK, where they were using, Bojo kept saying, I'm the guy who's representing freedom and democracy. What Bojo really wanted to do was cut regulation to the bone. That was his goal, that was his objective, but he wrapped himself around Brexit because the Labour Party effectively gave up the position in the argument. But he didn't argue, I want to cut regulation to the bone. He argued freedom and democracy. I'm saying it's the same thing here. This bill is being passed under this patriotic, this noble, helping the middle class and the poor through this rough crisis. Again, massively inadequate, and it doesn't necessarily do that in the realist sense of the word in regards to our material concerns as a nation. It does give tons of money to the corporate class. And for them to go along with it. No, I don't think it's a sellout. I just don't. If you're asking me, should he have gone along with it? No, I don't think he should have gone along with it. Yes, I think he should have held this bill up to get some level of scrutiny on this bill. Is there going to be political weight applied to the person to compel? Yes, it is. The last thing you want is to be the lone guy out holding up a bill with 50 senators effectively attacking you for holding this particular bill up, screaming that you're playing politics. It's somewhat of a tidal wave that I don't necessarily know which politician wants to stand there in the midst of that particular tidal wave. It's one thing if the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives came out with a plan of just sending checks to the population and leave it at that. This is what we're putting out. Meaning that the people who are in the Senate would have something to pivot against in regards to their plan, their idea, where you could try to meld some idea together. But that's not what happened. In this case, you don't have a situation where you're putting Republicans on guard in order to argue, no, we need to give this tax cuts, or we need to give these this cash, we need to give these trillions of dollars to our corporate class. That's what we got to do right now. You should make them make that argument. But that didn't happen. That didn't happen. Stoller has a point. I think he's being too strong in regards to his language on Sanders, but clearly he does have a point. Sanders basically backed this bill, and this bill was basically a corporate giveaway. The House of Representatives, AOC, did not back this bill. AOC was pretty hot about it, tearing at the bill itself, making the point that this is a cash grab. You shouldn't be supporting this particular bill. But it didn't matter. Donald Trump got the bill on his desk. Donald Trump signed this particular bill, and in a very short period of time, Congress snapped into action in order to give a huge amount of money to essentially the billionaire class. They're going to take that money and do whatever they want with it. They can lay off workers. They can use stock buybacks. They're open for the most part. There are restraints on small businesses, but the corporate class, not so much. As these businesses start to go under, you're going to have these bigger companies gobbling up these smaller companies. Look, I'd say Sanders, no, he didn't sell out America. In his head, he needs to get the money out. I suspect that's where he comes from this. I need to get the money out, and he needs to get money out. And between order of concerns, it is less order of concern to hold up this legislation as opposed to try to get the money to the various people who need it. This is kind of the problem with a society like ours. For all the talk of freedom and all the talk of liberty and everything else, how are you free in this context? How are you free? How is this freedom? You are going from paycheck to paycheck, meaning a gasp of air, week to week to week, never necessarily having a certain degree of comfort. It's always this kind of hectic thing of barely making ends meet. Most Americans don't have $500 in the bank for an emergency. Understand what that means in the context of a person who lives a life of perpetual vulnerability. Like, that's utterly astonishing that we're okay with this. And now you have a virus that hits, meaning the perpetual desperation is now amped up that much more because many of these people are losing their jobs or many of these industries are going belly up. And the thing that we decide that we need to take care of, our government snaps to attention in order to deal with the 1%. God, that's infuriating. But again, in Sanders' head, I think he looked at it as order of concerns. It is more important to get the money out. The catch becomes whether or not you think, what do you think is more important? Do you think it was more important to get that money out immediately and rapidly, and that it was somewhat of a fruitless effort to go against the entirety of Congress in order for that particular legislation? Meaning you might look at this in practical terms, not necessarily in terms of moral indignation at this kind of corporate giveaway. You may find that you've been beaten on this just by definition or just by the way of the political winds. You could very well come to that conclusion. Whether that's right or not is entirely dependent upon whether or not you think it matters. Meaning, if you think that the most important thing in the world is to get that money out to the population and that the money that is being stolen, for the most part, matters less, then you do this. Even though you might find that other parts are onerous, you do it. You get it out to the public as soon as possible and you continue to work on the legislation. If you think that it is more important in order to hold up that legislation, in order to get scrutiny on what is a clear corporate cash grab, then you hold the legislation up. It's an ideological versus a political point of view. Which one do you think matters more? Personally, I don't think there is a massive difference in holding up a bill for a week or two, as opposed, especially since the checks are going to take X amount of time to go out anyway, and trying to get an expedited payment system, as opposed to capitulating on a bill that doesn't go far enough in the sense of dealing with the material concerns of the population. Because basically, you're going to have to get another one of these bills in less than a month to deal with the next wave of issues that are going to befall this nation. Again, we've only been in this for about a month, and we have now taken over in regards to the number of cases. I think it's too strong to say Sanders sold America out. You might say he capitulated on something that he shouldn't have. Fair enough. That's kind of a value judgment thing on whether or not you think he should have did it. I think I'm in the mindset that no, he shouldn't have did it. You should have held this up. You should have had some level of scrutiny on this bill. Every time there is a crisis, you get this opportunity where they rate the country blind. And I would have preferred him being in the well of Congress screaming that, whether or not he had the ability to hold everything up or not, scream and make that argument. Yes, they're going to shout at you. Yes, they're going to say all sorts of bad names about you and everything else. The catch becomes, does it weaken you so politically where you may lose your seat? That's the only thing that really matters. If that answer is no, then no, you should push that particular case extremely hard. You need somebody to make that counter argument at a time where they are just flagrantly dumping money into these guys' hands. By the same token, you're stuck with this kind of pragmatic point of view of people are in need, we need to get the money out. I have to be honest, the sellout thing is too strong for me. To me, this boils down to a decision on what do you value most? Human beings in the way that we need to get the money out, or accountability in the sense that, no, we need to get that money out to those people. However, we shouldn't have a situation where we have to give all of this money to the corporate class to do so. And the problem here is basically the entirety of the Democratic Party went along with the entirety of the Republican Party on it. Sanders would have been the lone person out. Like, from a political point of view, I would imagine his leverage is pretty much non-existent, even though I suppose you could still hold it up on moral or principle positions. But sellout is too strong. I don't consider it a sellout. All right, I'm going to end this here. Like, share, and subscribe. Thanks, guys.